Audrey took a deep breath as she stepped into the sleek, glass-walled office. The waiting room felt cold, its sterile perfection a sharp contrast to the worn blazer she'd carefully chosen for this interview. She clutched her daughter Lily's hand tightly, wishing she could hide the nervous tremor in her fingers. As they walked to the seats, Audrey could feel the eyes of the other candidates on them, eyes that were quick to judge, quick to dismiss. She could hear the low murmurs as Lilly fidgeted beside her, drawing in her notebook, oblivious to the tension in the air. The door swung open, and the HR director, Ms. Carver, strode in. Her eyes flicked over Audrey and then down to Lilly, who was quietly sketching. "I'm afraid this isn't a daycare." "Ms." Carver said sharply, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "This is a professional setting, and bringing your child to an interview is unprofessional." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sharp click of Ms. Carver's heels as she moved toward the table. Audrey's face flushed with embarrassment, the sting of judgment biting at her. She opened her mouth to explain but was cut off by the laughter of the other candidates, the kind of laughter that didn't feel kind. Lilly, oblivious to the cruelty around her, suddenly stood up and walked over to the table. She placed her drawing in front of Ms. Carver, the simple sketch of the company building staring up at the panel. Beneath it, in Lily's childish handwriting, were the words, "If Mommy works here, I won't be hungry anymore." The room went still. The laughter died instantly, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Audrey's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. It was a small, innocent act, but it felt like everything had shifted. The air in the room felt different now, charged with a vulnerability that no one could ignore. Audrey's life had always been a balancing act, each day a delicate struggle between getting by and barely scraping through. As a single mother, her world revolved around Lilly, her 6-year-old daughter, and the overwhelming pressure of keeping their small, cramped apartment warm and filled with food. Audrey worked 2 part-time jobs, one at a coffee shop, the other as a cashier in a small grocery store, each job paying just enough to cover the bills, but never enough to give them a break. She wore her exhaustion like a second skin, the dark circles under her eyes a constant reminder of the sleepless nights spent worrying about their next meal. Every day felt like a battle, and yet, despite the exhaustion, Audrey kept moving forward. She couldn't afford to stop. She dreamed of a better life for Lilly, one where she didn't have to worry about where the next paycheck would come from, one where Lilly could have the stability she had never known. Audrey's dream job interview with a high-end corporation was supposed to be her chance, her last shot at building something real, something more for herself and for Lilly. She had worked tirelessly for this opportunity, reading up on the company, practicing her answers, trying to make sure she was prepared for any question that might come her way. She couldn't afford to mess this up. The morning of the interview, Audrey was already feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had woken up early, dressed in the best clothes she could manage, a worn blazer that was too big for her, and a pair of shoes that had seen better days. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, the fabric of the blazer hanging awkwardly around her shoulders, and reminded herself that she had done everything she could to get here. She had no other choice but to show up, to put on a brave face, and to hope that it would be enough. Lilly, oblivious to her mother's quiet anxiety, bounced excitedly beside her, clutching her backpack with one hand and holding Audrey's hand with the other. They boarded the bus, finding a seat by the window. Lilly chewed on the half-eaten granola bar Audrey had packed, her eyes sparkling with the innocent joy of childhood. Audrey watched her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. For a moment, everything felt like it was going to be okay. The simple act of sharing a quiet breakfast with her daughter in the calm of the morning was a small comfort, a reminder of the love that made everything worth it. As the bus rumbled down the street, Audrey held her daughter's hand tightly, determined not to let her nerves show. Today was the day that could change everything, and she would make sure that Lilly had the future she deserved. She just had to get through this one last hurdle. Audrey and Lilly sat down in the stark waiting room, the cold, sterile air pressing in around them. Audrey felt the eyes of the other candidates on her as she tried to make herself as small as possible, focusing on Lilly, who was happily drawing in her notebook. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the faint rustle of paper and the occasional cough. Audrey could feel the judgment coming from all directions, eyes flicking from her worn shoes to the frayed edges of her blazer, from Lily's mismatched socks to the simple backpack she carried. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A woman sitting across from Audrey leaned slightly toward the man beside her, her voice low but just loud enough to be heard. "She looks like she's here by mistake," she muttered, her eyes scanning Audrey's simple outfit with obvious disdain. Audrey forced herself not to react, but the sting of the words was impossible to ignore. The woman continued, her tone dripping with condescension, as she turned her attention to Lilly, who was quietly humming while drawing. "She's bringing her kid. How unprofessional." The whispered remarks, the sideways glances, they all piled up, each one making Audrey feel smaller and more out of place. She tried to tune it out, to focus on Lily's smile, but the weight of it was hard to shake. Audrey's hands tightened around the edge of the seat, the fabric of her sleeves pulling at her wrists. The feeling of being out of place, of not belonging, was overwhelming. She wasn't just here as a mother. She was here as a woman trying to prove she could be something more. And yet, everything about this room, this moment, was reminding her of how little she had. The other candidates, dressed in their expensive suits and polished shoes, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Audrey couldn't help but feel the difference: her worn-out shoes, her old blazer, the tiredness in her eyes. It all felt so obvious against their carefully crafted appearances. The harsh judgment of the room wasn't just visible. It was palpable, seeping into the air around her. Audrey knew she couldn't escape it, but she kept her head high, pretending to ignore the stares, her only focus now on Lily's innocent little face. Lilly sat cross-legged on the cold floor of the waiting room, crayons scattered around her like tiny treasures. She was completely absorbed in her drawing, her small fingers moving quickly across the page as she recreated the tall building outside the window. Audrey watched her daughter, a soft ache filling her chest as Lilly carefully captured the company's logo in bright colors, each line filled with childlike precision. As she finished, Lilly sat back, studying her work with a proud smile, then slowly added a message under the drawing. "If Mommy works here, we can have dinner together every night," she wrote in her shaky handwriting. Audrey felt her heart twist at the simple, innocent hope in those words. Lily's belief in her, so pure and unwavering, was a reminder of everything Audrey had been fighting for. She felt a lump form in her throat as she gazed at the drawing. It was just a simple picture, but in that moment, it felt like everything. Lilly didn't see the worn shoes, the frayed edges of her mother's clothes, or the tense atmosphere around them. She only saw the possibility, the dream, of a better life. Audrey's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting Lilly to see her struggle. She had promised herself she would give her daughter everything. But right now, it felt like she was failing her. Still, as Lilly looked up at her with wide, hopeful eyes, Audrey forced a smile, trying to believe in the possibility too. Audrey walked into the interview room, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was sterile, cold, and intimidating, just like the other candidates who sat around the long glass table. She tried not to feel small as she carefully placed Lilly on her lap, adjusting the hem of her old blazer. Audrey looked around at the panel. 5 people, all impeccably dressed, their eyes cool and indifferent. As she sat down, trying to make herself as composed as possible, the silence in the room felt suffocating. Ms. Carver, the HR director, glanced at Audrey, then at Lilly, her lips curling slightly in disapproval. "I'm afraid this is a professional setting," she said, her tone sharp. "Children aren't allowed in the interview." Audrey felt the sting of the words, but forced herself to remain calm. She cleared her throat and explained, as gently as she could, that Lilly had nowhere else to go today. "She's all I have," Audrey said quietly, her voice steady despite the anxiety swirling inside her. There was a brief pause, the air heavy with judgment, before Ms. Carver reluctantly nodded. Still, the panel's disapproval was palpable. Audrey could feel the cold eyes of the other candidates on her, as if they were silently judging her, questioning her ability to be here, to be in this room at all. The tension thickened, and Audrey's chest tightened as she shifted Lilly on her lap. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but she could already hear the quiet murmurs in her head. What kind of mother brings her child to an interview? Then, Mr. Dalton, a senior executive, leaned forward and smirked. "If you can't even manage a child, how are you supposed to manage a billion-dollar project?" His words felt like a slap, and Audrey's stomach sank. She knew she should defend herself, but all she could do was clench her jaw and keep her gaze fixed ahead. There was no room for weakness here. This moment was too important, too crucial to her future to let it slip away because of someone's harsh words. Audrey could feel her hands shaking slightly, but she steadied herself, forcing the anxiety down. This was her shot. Lilly was watching her, her innocent eyes searching her mother's face for reassurance, for a sign that everything would be okay. Audrey smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but was enough to make Lilly feel safe. She couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip away. Not for herself, and certainly not for Lilly. Lilly sat quietly on her mother's lap, unaware of the growing tension in the room. Her little hands moved swiftly with the crayons, the bright colors filling the page as she sketched the towering building outside. Audrey watched her daughter, heart heavy with the weight of the interview, but also with a flicker of warmth at Lily's innocence. She had no idea how the room had turned cold, or how the panel was silently judging her mother. But to Lilly, it was just another picture, a simple creation from the mind of a child who believed in the possibilities. Without any hesitation, Lilly stood up, holding the drawing in both hands. She walked to the center of the table and placed it in front of the panel, her small fingers brushing the edge of the paper. "If Mommy works here, we can have dinner together. Every night," she said, her voice soft but clear, the words hanging in the air like a promise. Audrey's breath caught in her throat as she watched Lilly, the vulnerability of the moment mixing with the hope in her daughter's eyes. For a moment, the room was still. Mr. Dalton, the senior executive, scoffed and pushed the drawing aside with a flick of his wrist. "This is trash," he muttered under his breath, as if it was nothing more than a distraction. His words were harsh, dismissive, and Audrey felt the sting of them like a slap. But as the paper slid across the table, something shifted. One of the assistant employees, a young woman with glasses, hesitated before picking up the drawing. She read the simple words on the page, her eyes softening as she understood the message behind it. The room remained silent, but the atmosphere had changed. The coldness in the air seemed to shift, just slightly, as the assistant held the drawing in her hands. For the first time in that room, someone saw the raw honesty of Lily's gesture, the simple, unspoken truth that this child believed so completely in her mother's potential. Audrey's eyes met the assistant's, and for just a second, the woman nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that spoke louder than anything the panel had said so far. The door to the interview room swung open, and in walked Thomas Reid, the CEO. His presence was immediately commanding, the quiet but intense energy filling the room as his sharp eyes took in the scene before him. The panel fell silent, instantly aware that the man who held the power to change everything had just entered. Audrey froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she glanced up at him. She had expected nothing more than dismissal, perhaps a quick exit. But now, everything was shifting. Thomas moved toward the table, his gaze landing on Lilly's drawing. His expression softened as he studied the picture, his eyes lingering on the simple, earnest message beneath it. The room seemed to shrink as Thomas picked up the drawing, turning it over in his hands, as if seeing something no one else had noticed. The cold, calculating energy that had dominated the room moments before evaporated, replaced by something deeper, more human. With a quiet sigh, Thomas looked up at the panel. "You know, my mother brought me to job interviews just like this when I was a child," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. She didn't have the luxury of fancy clothes or a polished resume, but she worked harder than anyone I've ever known. She fought for every opportunity, just like this woman is doing right now. The words hung in the air. The room caught in a collective breath as Thomas's revelation took root. He turned to Audrey, his gaze meeting hers with an understanding that made her heart skip. "I was that kid in the waiting room, watching my mother struggle, but never doubting her strength. I understand what it takes to keep going when the world tells you you're not enough." His voice softened. "Audrey, you've got the kind of strength and resilience that we need here. You're hired." The panel members exchanged surprised glances, clearly taken aback by the unexpected turn of events. Mr. Dalton opened his mouth to protest, but the look on Thomas's face stopped him before he could speak. The room had been turned on its head, and for the first time, the harsh judgments from the panel didn't matter. Audrey's entire body trembled with disbelief as she struggled to process what had just happened. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for so long lifted in an instant, replaced by a wave of hope and gratitude. Thomas Reid's simple act of empathy had changed everything. Audrey's life and Lilly's future was about to take a turn she had only dreamed of. As Audrey left the building, her heart still racing from the whirlwind of emotions, the receptionist watched her go, moved by what she had just witnessed. The young woman pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed out a tweet. "Saw a mom get humiliated today at Kane Corp. Her kid drew the company's building. CEO walked in. You won't believe what happened next." She hit send, unsure of the ripple effect her words might cause. Within minutes, the tweet was shared, retweeted, and commented on. The story spread like wildfire across social media, drawing the attention of people everywhere. They rallied behind Audrey, expressing outrage over the unfair treatment she had faced, and admiration for her quiet strength and resilience. The hashtag Audrey's Fight began trending, with thousands of messages of support flooding in. The internet, as powerful as ever, had become Audrey's ally. What had started as an unjust and humiliating moment now became a symbol of determination and integrity. Meanwhile, Ms. Carver and Mr. Dalton found themselves facing the consequences of their actions. Their dismissive behavior toward Audrey had not gone unnoticed, and as the story spread, their professional reputations began to tarnish. Former colleagues, clients, and even employees came forward, sharing their own experiences with the two executives. The world had recognized Audrey's worth something the cold corporate environment had failed to do. What had once felt like a moment of crushing defeat for Audrey now became a victory. She didn't just survive the interview, she had inspired a movement, People were seeing her for who she really was, and that was something money, power, or judgment couldn't take away. A week later, Audrey walked into the Kane Corporation building again. But this time, there was a different energy surrounding her. Lilly, her hand tightly clasped in her mother's, skipped along beside her. Audrey had been given a new title project lead, tasked with redesigning the company's hiring policies. It was a role she never thought she'd be in, especially just days after being treated like she didn't belong. As they entered the lobby, the receptionist smiled warmly at them, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey Audrey had been through. "Congratulations," she said softly. Audrey could see in the receptionist's eyes that her story had made an impact, not just on social media, but here, too. Audrey felt a quiet sense of pride as she walked down the hallway with Lilly. Despite the obstacles, the judgment, and the hardships, she had made it. She had worked hard, fought for herself and for Lilly, and now she was in a position to change things for others, like her. As they entered her new office, Audrey paused for a moment, looking out at the city below. Lilly tugged at her sleeve, looking up at her with those hopeful eyes. "We've come so far, haven't we?" Audrey said quietly, the weight of the journey sinking in. Lilly nodded, a bright smile on her face. Audrey knew this was just the beginning. She was determined to bring real change to this company, a change rooted in empathy, in seeing people for who they truly were, not just for the suit they wore or the title they held. Audrey placed Lilly's drawing on her desk, a reminder of the moment everything had shifted. "It's not just about policies," she said softly, as Lilly skipped off to the corner to start drawing again. "It's about remembering the humanity behind the work,